They bought an old mansion by mistake, thinking it was just an old, dilapidated building. But soon they found something shocking inside. Subscribe to the channel, write in the comments where you're watching from, and share this video with your friends. Michael Johnson had always dreamed of escaping the restless hum of Chicago. He loved the city for its energy, for its mosaic of cultures and sounds, but over the years its constant pulse had worn him down. Every day was noise, the clamor of trains, the endless honking of cars, neighbors arguing in narrow hallways. Rent consumed most of his paycheck from teaching history at the local high school, and his wife Evelyn's income from selling her art barely covered the rest. For years they had talked about finding a quieter life, a home where they could breathe, somewhere that didn't feel like it pressed against them from all sides. It was Evelyn who found the auction listing one night, scrolling idly on her tablet as they sat together in their cramped apartment. "Look at this," she had said, tilting the screen toward him. A historic property auction was offering old houses across several southern states. The photographs caught his attention immediately. Wide porches with ornate woodwork, grand staircases, towering trees dripping with Spanish moss. They weren't just houses. They were fragments of another era. Michael was captivated. He'd always loved history, not just reading it, but walking through it, touching its remnants. A thought took hold. What if they could buy one of these houses, restore it, and make it theirs? The prices were shockingly low. Most of these places were listed for a fraction of what a condo in Chicago cost. He imagined them working side by side, stripping old wallpaper, sanding floors, painting walls until their hands ached. But at the end of it all, standing on the porch of a home that was theirs, surrounded by silence and green fields instead of asphalt and sirens. They spent nights scrolling through the listings. Evelyn, ever cautious, worried about the cost. "We don't even know what kind of condition these places are in," she reminded him. "What if it's all rot and mold?" But Michael had a counter-argument for every concern. He reminded her they had both grown up with very little and learned to make do. They were resourceful, determined. And besides, wasn't this exactly what they wanted? To start over, away from the city's relentless grind? When the auction date arrived, Michael sat at their kitchen table, laptop open, heart pounding. The bidding moved quickly. Small cottages and modest farmhouses were snapped up in minutes. Then came a listing marked simply as Lot Hash 14, Historic Property Needs Renovation. The thumbnail photo was small and grainy, a large house partially obscured by overgrown trees. Michael squinted, barely able to make out the details, but he was drawn to it. He clicked on the bid button almost without thinking. At first, he didn't realize what he'd done. Numbers flashed on the screen, the price climbing in increments. His heart raced as he typed in their limit, fingers trembling slightly. Seconds later, a message appeared. "Congratulations, you've won Lot Hash 14. Evelyn leaned over his shoulder, eyes wide. "Wait, which one is that?" He clicked the details link. As the page loaded, Michael felt his stomach drop. The photo enlarged, revealing a massive 120-year-old mansion, its paint peeling, roof sagging, and windows boarded shut. It sat on several acres in a tiny town in the deep south neither of them had ever heard of. The description read simply, "Sold as is, structurally unstable. Buyer assumes all liability." "Oh my God," Evelyn whispered. "Michael, what did you do?" He tried to laugh it off, dialing the auction house to explain it was a mistake, but the clerk's voice was firm. All sales were final. The funds were already processed. Within a week, their fate was sealed. They packed their lives into a rented van, selling off furniture they couldn't take, and said goodbye to Chicago. The drive south felt surreal. Mile by mile, skyscrapers gave way to rolling fields, then to dense woods and narrow roads lined with weathered farmhouses. Evelyn stared out the window in silence much of the way, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Michael kept glancing at her, wondering if he had dragged them into a disaster they couldn't escape. When they finally arrived, the sight of the town unsettled them. It was small, quieter than they expected, only a few shops clustered along a main street, a gas station, a diner with faded lettering on its sign. People sitting outside the diner stopped mid-conversation to watch their van pass. Michael offered a friendly wave, but most of them simply stared. They followed directions from their phones until they turned onto a long, tree-lined drive. The mansion appeared suddenly at the end of it, looming behind a tangle of vines and wild grass. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The house was enormous, at least 3 stories high, its roofline jagged where tiles had fallen away. One shutter hung by a single hinge, swinging lightly in the breeze. Paint peeled in broad strips revealing the gray wood beneath. Michael parked, and they sat in silence, gazing at the building. Evelyn broke it first, her voice hushed. "It looks haunted." He forced a laugh, but couldn't shake the same thought. The air felt heavy here, almost still, as though time had stopped. When they stepped out of the van, the ground crunched underfoot. Dead leaves scattered across the drive despite it being early spring. Inside town, the reception was no warmer. At the general store, an older man behind the counter eyed them cautiously when Michael asked for directions to a hardware shop. "You folks bought the Patterson place?" he asked, voice low. Michael hesitated, then nodded. The man frowned. "That house has been empty near 30 years. Ain't no one stayed there longer than a season." His gaze shifted between them, lingering on Michael. "Some places don't want to be lived in." Outside, a woman filling her car with gas glanced at them and muttered to a friend, loud enough to be heard, "City folks buying that cursed house." Evelyn's stomach tightened at the word. That night, they parked their van in front of the mansion and carried in sleeping bags. The rooms smelled of dust and decay. Moonlight filtered through broken slats, painting pale lines across warped floorboards. Michael lit a lantern and set it in the center of the front hall. They laid out their bedding, too exhausted to explore further. As they lay there in the dark, Evelyn turned toward him. "What if they're right?" she whispered. "What if this place is a mistake we can't fix?" Michael stared up at the shadowed ceiling. Despite his fear, something deep within him stirred, a strange pull, as though the house itself was watching, waiting. "Then we'll make it right," he said softly. Outside, an owl called from the woods. The house groaned faintly, a sound like old bones shifting. Neither of them slept well that night. The next morning came slowly, its pale light creeping through the gaps in the boarded windows and laying narrow streaks across the dusty floor. Michael woke first, his back sore from the hard boards beneath their sleeping bags. For a moment, he lay still, listening. The house was silent except for the faint sigh of wind pressing against its walls. He turned his head to look at Evelyn, who was curled tightly under her blanket, her brow faintly furrowed even in sleep. She looked smaller than usual, fragile against the backdrop of this vast, decaying house. He rose quietly and walked toward the main door, stepping carefully over warped boards that creaked sharply under his weight. Pulling it open, he stepped outside. The morning air was cool and heavy with dew, and the garden, or what had once been a garden, stretched wild around the house. Weeds had overtaken flower beds long forgotten. Ivy had climbed up the porch pillars and spilled across the facade, and tall grasses reached nearly to his waist in places. He inhaled deeply, trying to shake off the unease from the night before, but there was a stillness to the property that unsettled him. By the time Evelyn awoke, Michael had already boiled water for instant coffee on a small camping stove they'd brought from Chicago. They sat together on the front steps, cradling their mugs, gazing silently at the house as the sun climbed higher and revealed more of its flaws: cracked window frames, loose shingles, and a leaning chimney. In daylight, the mansion seemed even larger than it had the night before, towering over them like a sleeping giant. "We should see what we're really dealing with," Michael said finally. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She sipped her coffee, staring at the broken porch railings. "I guess we should." Armed with flashlights and masks, they began their inspection. Dust filled the air as they pried open stuck doors and wandered room by room. In what had once been a parlor, heavy velvet curtains still clung limply to their rods, riddled with moth holes. A grand piano stood in the corner, its keys yellowed and warped. When Evelyn pressed one out of curiosity, it gave a hollow clunk rather than a note. The dining room was worse. A portion of the ceiling had collapsed, scattering plaster and wooden lath across a long table still set with shattered dishes, as though a meal had been abandoned mid-course decades ago. The kitchen reeked of mildew, the walls streaked from an old leak that had never been repaired. "What happened here?" Evelyn murmured as they stepped carefully over debris. In the hallway, Michael paused before an ornate staircase whose banister was coated in grime but still held hints of fine craftsmanship beneath. He ran his hand along it, imagining the people who had once climbed it: guests in evening clothes, servants carrying trays, children sliding down its polished rail. Yet now it felt cold and alien, stripped of life. They found the entrance to the basement hidden behind a warped door at the end of the hall. The hinges shrieked as Michael forced it open. A damp chill wafted upward, carrying the smell of earth and mold. He hesitated, then started down the narrow steps with his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Evelyn followed reluctantly, one hand gripping his shoulder. The basement floor was packed dirt, uneven and littered with broken crates and rusted tools. Against one wall stood an old wooden trunk, its iron fittings flaking with rust. Michael knelt before it, brushing away cobwebs, and forced it open. Inside lay a jumble of yellowed papers, faded photographs, and a few small objects wrapped in cloth. He lifted a photograph and froze. It showed a group posed in front of the mansion, a stern-looking white family dressed in early 1900s finery, flanked by several black servants. One of those servants, a tall man standing slightly apart from the rest, bore an uncanny resemblance to Michael. The same jawline, the same eyes. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Evelyn leaned over his shoulder. Michael, he looks like you." He swallowed hard, staring at the image. "It's just coincidence," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He shuffled through the other papers, finding letters in delicate cursive, brittle property records, and scraps of receipts. Many of the names repeated. Patterson, listed as the owners, and among the servants' names, one that made his chest tighten: Sarah Johnson. "My grandmother's name was Sarah Johnson," Michael murmured, scanning the letterhead dates: 1912, 1913. "You don't think—" Evelyn began, but trailed off. He folded one letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "We'll look into it later," he said, though his heart was pounding. Upstairs again, as they explored further, Evelyn noticed something strange. On several door frames and window sills, faint carvings were etched into the wood. They were small, almost hidden under grime, symbols that looked like crude stars or crossed lines, interwoven in lupin patterns. She traced one with her fingertip, shivering slightly. "What do you think these are?" Michael examined one closely. "Protective marks," he guessed. "I've read about things like this. People used to carve symbols to ward off evil or bad luck." The words hung uneasily between them as they continued. By late afternoon, they had covered most of the main floor and ventured cautiously upstairs. The bedrooms were frozen in time, wallpaper curling in yellowed strips, iron bed frames rusted, old trunks spilling forgotten clothes. One room still held a vanity, and its mirror cracked but intact. Evelyn paused before it, her reflection fractured. For just an instant, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of something standing behind her, but when she spun around, the room was empty. She didn't mention it to Michael. That night, they unrolled their sleeping bags again in the front hall. The lantern's glow cast long shadows up the staircase and across the walls, making the carvings seem to shift when glanced at sideways. They ate cold sandwiches, too tired to cook, and tried to distract themselves with small talk. But when the house settled, wood groaning deep in its frame, wind pressing against loose boards, it felt alive in a way neither of them could explain. Hours later, long after Evelyn had drifted into uneasy sleep, Michael lay awake, staring at the darkened ceiling. He could almost hear whispers, faint and distant, like voices speaking in another room. He told himself it was only wind funneled through broken chimneys or his imagination fueled by exhaustion. Yet, he couldn't shake the image of the man in the photograph. He turned on his side and reached for Evelyn's hand, holding it tightly. Somewhere deep within the walls, something creaked, followed by the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps. When morning came again, both of them were pale from lack of rest, but Michael was already resolved. Today, they would learn more. They needed answers about this house, about its past, its owners, and the names in those letters. And most of all, about why the man in that faded photograph looked so much like him. The third morning came with a sky the color of pewter and an air heavy enough to make the trees hang motionless. Evelyn woke first this time, her body aching from another night on the hard floor, and found Michael already sitting on the porch steps, staring out over the wild tangle of grass and vines that had once been a yard. He had the photograph in his hand again, the one of the Pattersons and their servants, his thumb brushing over the face of the man who looked so uncannily like him. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, and then stepped out quietly to join him. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence that hung over the property was unlike anything they had known in the city. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, as if the very air carried memories that refused to fade. Evelyn shivered and sat beside him. He handed her the photograph without looking at her. "I couldn't stop thinking about it," he said at last, his voice low. "That man. Sarah Johnson's name on those letters. My grandmother used to tell stories, about her grandmother who worked in a big house down south. I never thought much of it, but what if this is it?" Evelyn glanced at the photograph, her fingers trembling slightly. "If it is, then we're standing on more than just land. This could be part of your history." Michael exhaled sharply and looked up at the mansion looming behind them. Its windows stared back, blank and dark, as though they were eyes that had seen too much. "I need to know," he said. After breakfast, they drove into town. The library was small, tucked into a squat brick building that looked older than most of the shops around it. Inside, it smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Michael headed straight for the local history section, pulling out whatever he could find on the town and its landmarks. Evelyn drifted through the narrow aisles, her fingers trailing along shelves of books, until she heard a voice behind her. "You two are the ones who bought the Patterson place, aren't you?" She turned to see an elderly woman, her gray hair pulled back into a bun, peering at her over half-moon glasses. Evelyn nodded hesitantly. The woman's expression shifted into something unreadable. "My mother used to tell me stories about that house," she said softly. "Said it was cursed. Folks went missing. The Pattersons themselves disappeared one night. Poof, gone. Some say they ran off, others, well," she leaned closer. "Others say their servants rose up and took revenge, but no one ever proved a thing. After that, nobody stayed in that house long." Evelyn felt a chill creep up her spine. "Do you know anything about their servants?" she asked. The woman frowned thoughtfully. "There were records, I think. Old census logs, maybe." She pointed toward Michael, who was hunched over a stack of books. "That one's digging in the right place. But I'll tell you this, people don't like to talk about it. Too much bad blood in those days." When they returned to the mansion, Michael carried a folder of photocopied documents. He spread them across the floor, sifting through brittle images of yellowed text and faded ink. Among them were lists of names, servants, farmhands, tenants who'd once worked the Patterson land. And there it was again. Sarah Johnson, listed year after year. "She was here," Michael whispered. "This was her life." They decided to explore the grounds further, combing through the waist-high grass and weeds that choked the estate. It was Evelyn who first stumbled upon the edge of stone, half buried under ivy. She knelt and pulled it back, revealing a weathered headstone leaning precariously to one side. "Michael," she called, her voice tight. He hurried to her side, and together they cleared more vines. Soon they uncovered several more stones, their inscriptions worn but legible. Names etched in shallow grooves stared back at them: servants, laborers, children. At the center stood a small crypt, its door sealed shut with rusted iron. Michael's breath caught when he saw one name carved cleanly across a headstone: Sarah Johnson, 1868, 1920. He knelt before it, tracing the letters with his fingers as though touching proof that his grandmother's stories had been real. Evelyn rested a hand on his shoulder. "She's here," she said softly. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. For a moment, the world felt suspended, the wind stirring just enough to whisper through the overgrowth as though the land itself acknowledged their presence. That night, sleep did not come easily. The house seemed more alive than ever. The old walls groaned and shifted, faint taps echoed in the halls, and Evelyn swore she heard distant footsteps pacing slowly above them, even though they had locked every upstairs room. At one point, she jolted awake, convinced she'd heard a woman's voice humming faintly, a lullaby that seemed to drift through the floorboards and wrap around her like a memory she didn't own. The next morning, Michael returned to the basement trunk and dug deeper through its contents. Beneath loose papers and broken trinkets, he found a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was delicate, slanted in elegant strokes. They were signed by Sarah Johnson. He sat on the floor, unfolding them one by one. Most were brief, addressed, "To my children and their children after them." She wrote about long days of work, about dreams she dared not speak aloud. In one, her words trembled off the page. "This house has seen too much pain, but I pray there will come a time when our blood walks these halls not as servants, but as masters, reclaiming what was taken from us." He read it aloud to Evelyn, his voice hushed. She leaned against him, staring at the fragile paper in his hands. "It's like she's talking to you," Evelyn murmured. Michael folded the letter carefully. "Maybe she is." From that day, their view of the mansion changed. It no longer felt merely like a mistake or a burden. It felt like a calling. Michael spoke of Sarah's words often, his determination hardening. If his ancestor had endured this place in chains, then their task was clear. They would restore it, not just for themselves, but for her memory. Yet the house did not grow quieter. At night, the sounds deepened, the low groan of beams, faint echoes of movement in distant rooms. Once, as Evelyn stood brushing her teeth in a cracked mirror, she glimpsed the reflection of a figure behind her. A woman in an old-fashioned dress, standing still and silent. She spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. When she told Michael, he didn't dismiss her. Instead, he looked towards the stairs where darkness pooled and said quietly, "Maybe it's her." As days passed, the line between past and present blurred. They worked on clearing the grounds, uncovering more graves, each one tied to names from the old records. They patched broken windows and swept rooms thick with dust, yet at every turn they felt watched, guided even, as though unseen hands urged them onward. And still, tucked in Sarah's final letter, lay a single cryptic line that neither could ignore. "The truth of us lies hidden in the room they could not find." Michael stared at those words long after the sun had set, lantern light flickering across his face. Somewhere in this house a secret waited, a room sealed away, holding the truth of what had happened here, of Sarah's life, of the night that ended the Patterson family. He was determined to find it. The morning after Michael discovered Sarah's final letter arrived damp and gray, with clouds that seemed to press low against the earth, making the mansion appear even larger, its decaying roof line stark against the sky. The house no longer felt like just a crumbling building they had to fix. It had become something deeper, a living monument tethered to Michael's bloodline and Sarah's words that lingered in his mind like a command. Evelyn watched him as he sat at the old wooden table they had dragged into the front hall, spreading Sarah's letters out before him with the intensity of someone deciphering a map. His coffee had gone cold in his hands, but he didn't seem to notice. "We need to start the real work," he said finally, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "If we're going to make this place ours, if we're going to honor her, we have to rebuild it from the ground up." Evelyn glanced around at the cracked plaster walls, the sagging ceiling above, the warped floorboards that groaned under every step. "Michael, it's going to take more than just us," she said. "We barely have enough money left for supplies, let alone contractors." He looked up at her with steady determination. "Then we do it ourselves." Those words became their mantra in the days that followed. They emptied their savings, buying only the most essential materials. Wood for bracing the walls, tarps to cover the leaking roof, basic tools to replace the few they had brought from Chicago. At night, Evelyn lay awake listening to the restless sounds of the old mansion, while Michael scribbled notes by lantern light, drawing rough diagrams of repairs they would tackle in the morning. They moved out of the house temporarily when the dust and mold became too much to bear, dragging an old trailer they'd purchased from a junk dealer onto the property. It was cramped and smelled faintly of rust, but it was dry, and in its own way it felt safer than sleeping under the collapsing roof of the mansion. Every evening they fell asleep to the distant creak of its timbers and the rustling of wind through its empty halls, reminders of the work ahead and the presence of something that seemed to watch them from within. The days became a relentless rhythm of labor. Michael braced rotten beams in the kitchen while Evelyn tore out warped flooring in the upstairs hall. They cleared piles of debris that had sat untouched for decades, splintered furniture, moldy drapes, and boxes of broken dishes from another era. Each room revealed new problems. A section of wall where rainwater had chewed through the plaster, stair treads splintered and unsafe, windows shattered so thoroughly that entire frames had to be replaced. The more they worked, the more it felt like the house resisted them. One afternoon, while Michael hauled lumber from the trailer to shore up a buckling doorway, he heard a crash from upstairs. He ran up to find Evelyn standing pale and breathless in what had once been a bedroom. A section of ceiling had given way, plaster and dust raining down, narrowly missing her. "I didn't even touch it," she whispered, her hands trembling. Michael pulled her close, dust streaking their clothes. "We'll fix it," he said, even as his own heart pounded. Money dwindled faster than either of them had expected. Every trip to the hardware store seemed to cost more than the last. Their food budget shrank to instant noodles and canned beans, and still it wasn't enough. Evelyn sold 2 of her paintings online for a fraction of their worth, watching them ship off in brown boxes to strangers she would never meet. Michael pawned his old guitar, an instrument he had carried since college, telling himself it was only temporary. Their struggles didn't go unnoticed. In town, whispers followed them. At the diner, 2 men seated at the counter spoke loudly enough for Evelyn to hear. Why'd they even bother? That place should have been torn down years ago. Another woman muttered, "They'll never last through winter out there." Yet, some people began to watch them with a different kind of curiosity. The clerk at the hardware store slipped them an extra box of nails without charge one afternoon. A young man from the lumber yard offered to help them haul supplies to their trailer. Still, there was an unspoken boundary. Everyone knew the house's reputation, and no one dared cross its threshold. It was during one of their rare breaks, sitting in the overgrown yard with sandwiches balanced on their knees, that Evelyn spotted the crypt again. Its rusted iron door seemed to beckon from beneath the shadows of an ancient oak tree. "I keep thinking about it," she said quietly. "What's inside? What if there are more answers there?" Michael followed her gaze. "Maybe," he said, "but not yet. Not until we've made the house safe enough to focus on anything else." Still, the crypt nagged at both of them. Each time they passed it, clearing brush or hauling supplies, Michael felt the weight of Sarah's grave nearby, as though her spirit lingered there, urging him on. Despite exhaustion, progress came slowly. They repaired a section of roof over the west wing, patching holes that had let in decades of rain. Evelyn painted the front door a deep, rich color, a small defiance against the decay that clung to everything else. They trimmed back the wild vines crawling over the porch, uncovering intricate woodwork hidden beneath layers of neglect. Yet, with every improvement, the house seemed to breathe louder. Nights grew heavier. The faint humming Evelyn had heard before returned, sometimes drifting through the halls so softly that they weren't sure if it was real or imagined. Once, Michael woke in the trailer to see the silhouette of the mansion outlined in moonlight, its windows glimmering faintly, though no light burned within. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, figures shifting behind those panes, but when he blinked, they were gone. Their exhaustion deepened, and their tempers frayed. Arguments flared over trivial things, whether to spend their last bit of money on plywood or sealant, whose turn it was to haul water from town because the house's plumbing was too corroded to trust. But always, after the anger faded, they sat together beneath the stars or in the shadow of the old porch and reminded each other why they stayed. "This is bigger than us," Michael said one night, staring out at the dark shape of the mansion. "It's about her, about Sarah. She wanted her children to come back here. I can feel it every time I walk through those halls." Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder. "I believe you," she said, though her voice was soft. "I just don't know how much more we can take." The following week brought a discovery neither of them had expected. While clearing debris in what they assumed was a storage room off the old library, Michael noticed a faint draft where there shouldn't have been one. He traced it to a section of wall paneled with dark wood. When he knocked on it, the sound was hollow. "Evelyn," he called, his voice trembling. Together they examined it, running their hands along its seams until they found a narrow gap, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. It was a door, concealed so seamlessly it might have gone unnoticed forever. They exchanged a look, neither speaking, before Michael fetched a crowbar and pried it open. Beyond lay a narrow passage, dark and cool, its air stale with disuse. They shone their flashlights inside, beams cutting through dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts. The corridor ended in another door, this one plain but solid, its iron handle stiff from rust. Michael's hand hovered over it. "This could be it," he whispered. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. "The truth of us lies hidden in the room they could not find." He turned the handle. The door resisted, then groaned open on rusted hinges. Their flashlights illuminated a chamber preserved by time itself, untouched by the decay that ravaged the rest of the mansion. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes and books, jars of yellowing paper, and framed photographs. In the center sat a simple wooden table, and atop it lay a ledger, its leather cover cracked but intact. Evelyn stepped forward first, her breath catching. "What is this place?" Michael stared, awe and dread twined together in his chest. "It's her room," he said, "Sarah's room, the one they couldn't find." They didn't enter that night. Instead, they stood in the doorway, staring at the room as though afraid that crossing its threshold might change everything. And perhaps it already had. When they returned to the trailer, neither could sleep. The mansion loomed behind them, its windows glinting faintly in the moonlight, as if aware of what they had uncovered. Somewhere, deep inside, they both knew. They had crossed a line. The trials they had faced so far were only the beginning. The next day, they would step inside. Morning light came pale and hesitant, filtered through clouds that seemed unwilling to break. Michael awoke early, his sleep restless and shallow, haunted by the image of the hidden door and the untouched room beyond it. He sat at the small table inside the trailer, staring at Sarah's letters as if the ink might shift and rearrange itself into answers. Evelyn stirred beside him, her hair mussed from sleep, and joined him without a word. They didn't need to speak. Both were thinking the same thing. After a quick breakfast, they gathered their tools and flashlights, neither quite meeting the other's gaze. The mansion loomed silently as they approached, its weathered walls holding the same oppressive stillness, though today it seemed more watchful than usual. Inside, the air was cool and faintly damp, tinged with the scent of wood and dust. They made their way directly to the library, stepping over the warped floorboards they had already learned to avoid. The concealed passageway waited as they had left it, the hollow knock of its false panel sounding unnervingly loud in the quiet. Michael pushed the panel aside and led the way, their flashlights cutting thin cones of light into the darkness. The narrow corridor felt colder than the rest of the house, as though it had been sealed from warmth for decades. Dust clung to their boots, and each step echoed faintly against the walls. At the end of the hall, the plain wooden door stood like a sentinel, its handle rough with rust. Michael grasped it, the metal icy beneath his fingers, and turned. The door yielded with a protesting groan, and the stale air within rolled out to meet them. They stepped inside. The room was small but meticulously arranged, its preservation eerie in a house otherwise swallowed by decay. Shelves lined 3 walls filled with boxes, bound ledgers, stacks of letters tied with ribbon, and framed photographs whose glass had yellowed slightly but remained unbroken. A single table occupied the center, bearing an open book, a fountain pen long dried and brittle beside it. The only window, narrow and high, admitted a soft wash of light that seemed too faint for the hour. Evelyn's breath hitched audibly. She ran her hand over one of the shelves, tracing the edges of the books. "It's like it's been waiting for someone," she whispered. Michael approached the table and carefully examined the open ledger. Its pages were filled with neat, flowing handwriting, dates spanning years he recognized from the early 1900s. At first, they appeared to be simple daily accounts, lists of supplies, wages noted in tidy columns. But further in, the entries shifted. Paragraphs replaced figures, written in the same hand that had signed Sarah's letters. He read aloud, his voice low, the words trembling slightly. "We work from dawn until the stars burn out. The masters dine in excess while we bury our dead in the fields, unmarked and unseen. Yet I keep this record because someone must remember." Evelyn's hand found his shoulder as he turned more pages, each entry weaving a clearer picture. Sarah had chronicled everything: the long hours in the fields, the punishments meted out in private, the endless labor endured by those who lived within the mansion's shadow. She wrote of whispered plans, of quiet defiance, of gathering courage in stolen moments by the kitchen hearth. Her words carried both pain and an unyielding strength that seemed to pulse from the page. At one point, Michael stopped, staring at an entry dated months before Sarah's death. "They fear us now. Mr. Patterson grows paranoid, his hand always near his pistol. We have spoken of what must be done, and though my hands tremble as I write this, I know we are past the point of return. When they strike next, we will not bow." The words were stark, blunt in their certainty. Michael glanced at Evelyn, who was pale but listening intently. "This wasn't just a servant's diary," he said quietly. This is a record of rebellion." Evelyn moved to another shelf, pulling down one of the boxes. Inside were photographs. Men and women in work clothes standing in clusters near the mansion's outbuildings. Their faces bore expressions of fatigue, but also quiet dignity. Among them, Michael spotted Sarah immediately, her gaze sharp and unflinching even through the faded image. Other photos showed the Pattersons in stiff, formal poses, their wealth evident in every detail. One box held artifacts: a worn pair of leather gloves, a silver brooch tarnished to dull gray, and a folded scrap of fabric that Evelyn unfolded carefully to reveal a child's dress, hand-stitched and neatly mended. Beneath it lay a letter written in Sarah's unmistakable script. Michael unfolded it gently, his hands shaking slightly. "If you read this, you are mine. My blood, my kin. This house was our burden and our bondage, but it shall be our reclamation. We rose that night not for vengeance alone, But so our children might stand here one day unchained. Let no one bury our truth again. The words seemed to press into him like a physical weight. Michael sank into the lone chair at the table, the letter trembling between his fingers. He could almost see it now, the night of revolt, whispered voices in darkened halls, the clatter of hurried steps and the sharp report of violence. The disappearance of the Pattersons wasn't some vague mystery, it was this. His ancestor and the others had risen against them, and the town had buried it in silence. Evelyn moved to his side, her hand finding his. "She wrote it for you," she said softly. Michael swallowed hard. "For all of us." They spent hours in that room, poring over its contents. Each letter, each record stitched together a story long suppressed. They read accounts of those who had lived and died on the land, names they now recognized from the gravestones they had uncovered. They found maps of the property drawn in Sarah's hand, showing boundaries and hidden corners, even a note marking the crypt outside, our resting place, where they cannot erase us. As the afternoon light dimmed, Evelyn lit a lantern they had brought, its glow throwing long shadows across the walls. In that flickering light, the room felt both solemn and sacred, a space where time held its breath. At one point, Michael lifted his gaze from the ledger and glanced toward the door. He thought he saw movement then, just a flicker, like the edge of a figure slipping out of view, but when he rose to look, the passage beyond was empty. Still, he felt no fear. Instead, a strange calm settled over him, as if the house itself acknowledged their presence in a way it hadn't before. When they finally left, night had fallen fully. They carried several of Sarah's letters and the ledger with them, careful to leave the rest untouched. Back in the trailer, Michael set them on the table and sat down heavily. Evelyn brewed tea on their small stove, the simple ritual grounding them after what they had unearthed. "This changes everything," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Michael nodded. "It does. This isn't just a renovation anymore. It's about finishing what she started, giving her and everyone else buried here the recognition they deserve." He glanced toward the mansion, its silhouette stark against the star-pinned sky. "This house isn't just ours now, it's theirs too." They spent the rest of the night talking, weaving plans from exhaustion and determination alike. They spoke of restoring not just the house, but its history, of creating something that honored what had been endured here. Even in their weariness, there was a spark of resolve between them that hadn't been there before, as though Sarah herself had passed it into their hands through the pages of her words. When they finally slept, it was dreamless and deep, the first peaceful rest either of them had had since they arrived. Outside, the mansion stood silent but no longer hostile, its dark windows reflecting moonlight like watchful eyes. For the first time, Michael felt not just the burden of Sarah's legacy, but its strength. Tomorrow they would continue, repairing walls, clearing the grounds, scrubbing away years of decay, but now each task carried a weight and purpose that made it more than work. Tomorrow they would begin not only rebuilding the house, but reclaiming its soul. The morning after their discovery in the hidden room was brighter than any they had seen since coming to this place. Sunlight poured through breaks in the clouds and filtered over the land, gilding the tangled grass and casting the mansion in a light that almost made it look alive again. Michael stood outside with a cup of coffee, gazing up at it with a strange mixture of awe and familiarity. It no longer felt like a ruin looming over them. It felt claimed, anchored, as though the house had finally acknowledged their presence and allowed them in. Evelyn joined him silently, slipping her arm around his waist. They stood like that for a long time, watching the play of light on wood and stone. In the weeks that followed, they threw themselves into the work as if possessed, their bodies aching, but their spirits driven by a purpose neither of them had ever felt so deeply before. The discovery of Sarah's room in the ledger transformed every nail hammered, every plank laid, every brushstroke of paint into something sacred. This was no longer just renovation. It was restoration of memory, of justice, of a story buried and waiting for them to unearth it. Michael began each day by reading a few lines from Sarah's letters before lifting his tools, her words steadying him like a blessing. He often paused mid-task, gazing out over the land or up at the beams of the house, imagining Sarah herself walking these halls after hours of toil, her hands rough and cracked, her heart heavy but unbowed. He worked for her. He worked for everyone whose names they had found etched on the gravestones in the yard. Evelyn, too, felt it. Her every brushstroke as she repainted the window frames seemed to breathe color back into the skeleton of the mansion. Their labor was grueling. They tore out rotted boards and rebuilt the floors of the upstairs bedrooms, repaired gaping holes in the roof, until finally the rain stayed out and scrubbed away decades of grime from every surface they could reach. Evelyn worked in the garden when the weather was clear, cutting back thorny vines, uprooting weeds, and uncovering the outlines of old stone paths. As she cleared the earth, she found remnants of what had once been a beautiful landscape. Broken pieces of statuary, rusted tools, and even a small cast-iron bench half buried in soil. She cleaned each discovery and placed it back where it seemed to belong, slowly coaxing the grounds into coherence again. When the roof was finally whole, Michael stood atop it at sunset, sweat streaking his face, and looked out across the land. The view was breathtaking. Rolling fields framed by distant trees, the crypt visible among the shadows of the old oak. For the first time, he felt truly rooted. This was home. Word spread in town of the progress they were making. Where once they had been met with skepticism and whispered doubts, now people stopped them at the hardware store to ask how things were going. Some offered advice on construction. Others simply nodded in quiet approval. An older man named Mr. Clark even drove out one afternoon to drop off a bundle of lumber, saying only, "Figured you might need it," before leaving again without ceremony. Their efforts were breaking down the quiet barriers that had kept the townsfolk distant, even if curiosity still clung to every glance cast toward the old Patterson place. Inside the house, they continued to explore Sarah's room. They cataloged her letters and documents, careful to preserve every piece. Evelyn suggested they eventually frame some of the photographs, to hang them along the mansion's central hallway so that visitors would see the faces of those who had once lived and worked here. Michael agreed, his chest swelling with a sense of duty and pride he hadn't known before. They decided, too, that when the house was fully restored, they would open it to the public, not as some tourist attraction, but as a cultural and historical center dedicated to those who had been forgotten. They wanted it to be a place of remembrance, of acknowledgement, a living testament to resilience. Evelyn envisioned guided tours through the halls, telling the stories hidden for over a century, and perhaps even creating a small exhibit in Sarah's preserved room so people could see it as they had first found it. As their plans took shape, they began preparing for an unveiling that felt more ceremonial than practical. Michael wrote to his extended family inviting them to visit once the work was complete. Many of them knew little of their ancestry beyond the broad strokes of hardship and migration, but when he spoke of Sarah, Of her words and her courage, they responded with eagerness and anticipation. The final weeks of preparation were exhausting. They painted walls until their arms trembled, polished the wooden stair banister until it gleamed, and brought in simple but elegant furniture they found second-hand. Evelyn sewed curtains for the windows, filling the rooms with soft fabric that fluttered gently in the breeze, and Michael refinished the front door, restoring its carved panels to a deep, lustrous glow. The crypt outside they cleaned and cleared of overgrowth, planting flowers around it so that it no longer felt neglected, but instead revered, a quiet place of rest. The day of the unveiling dawned clear and bright. Family arrived from across the state and beyond, their cars winding up the long drive one by one. Michael greeted them with a mix of nerves and excitement, watching their faces as they took in the house standing proud against the sky. The mansion, once a symbol of decay and whispered curses, now exuded a solemn dignity. Its windows sparkled in the sun, its porch railings freshly painted, and the front steps swept clean. Evelyn stood beside him, her smile wide though her eyes shone with tears. Inside, they led their guests room by room, showing them the work they had done and the discoveries they had made. In Sarah's preserved room, silence fell as Michael read aloud from her letters, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Many wiped their eyes as they listened, the weight of history settling over them like a mantle both heavy and proud. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, they gathered outside by the crypt. Michael spoke of Sarah and those buried there, of their courage and endurance. He spoke of how this house, once a prison of labor, had been reclaimed by their descendants and turned into a sanctuary of memory and justice. When he finished, there was a long stillness, broken only by the sound of wind rustling the leaves. That evening, as their guests departed, Michael and Evelyn stood on the porch together, hand in hand. The lantern light from within spilled warmly onto the steps, and the night was filled with the chirping of crickets and the soft calls of distant birds settling to roost. They looked out at the land, now theirs not only in name, but in spirit. "This place was waiting for us," Evelyn said quietly, leaning against him. Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the mansion's glowing windows. "It chose us," he replied, "and now it's finally home." Above them, the stars emerged one by one, scattered across the sky like a promise fulfilled. The mansion stood steady and silent, its long-suppressed history finally given voice, its halls filled once more not with silence and ruin, but with purpose and belonging. And for the first time since they had set foot on this land, neither of them felt its weight pressing down on them. Instead, it lifted, leaving only the sense that they had done what Sarah had asked of them all along. In that moment, Michael imagined her presence watching from the shadows of the porch, not as a restless ghost, but as a guardian finally at peace. And as he and Evelyn turned to go inside, the old floorboards creaked gently beneath their feet, no longer sounding like a house in decay, but like a home breathing once more. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Watch our other videos for more incredible stories, and don't forget to share this video with your friends and family.